You ever notice how some child stars make it out and some just don't? Like, genuinely. What does that do to a child's brain? What does fame do to a child when their identity is being built in front of cameras, under pressure, under adults, under contracts and obsessive parents, under the weight of everybody's expectations? Because let's be honest, we have seen this story over and over again. For example, Amanda Bynes, who was a bright, funny, charismatic little girl, super funny. I used to watch her all the time on, Nickelodeon. She was Nickelodeon's sweetheart. And then the public watched what looked like a complete unraveling. And before anybody says, well, we don't know everything, exactly, that's the point. We don't know everything. But we know enough to know that childhood fame can absolutely destroy people. Britney Spears started young, pushed very young age, was part of the Disney machine, America's sweetheart, mega fame. And then there was a complete breakdown, substance struggles, public humiliation on a daily basis, the paparazzi circus, the shaved head, the umbrella incident. Then a conservatorship where for years, the woman who made millions and millions of dollars for everybody else and herself couldn't fully control her own life. The Free Britney movement happened for a reason, and that should scare all of us. Lindsay Lohan is another example. Child star, filled with pressure, then fell into addictions. There was a public collapse, and then there was years of tabloids treating her pain like literal entertainment for all of us. Macaulay Culkin, one of the most recognizable children on earth. Richie Rich childhood. Fame, estrangement, substance issues, trying to reclaim normalcy for the rest of his life until he got it. But then there's Drew Barrymore as well, who was going to Studio 54 as a literal child using substances before adulthood. Rehab before most kids even knew algebra. What the fuck does that do to a developing brain? Then you have people who just walk away entirely, like Mary-Kate Olsen and Ashley Olsen, who reach global child fame, complete icons, and now they want nothing to do with cameras. Cole Sprouse and Dylan Sprouse, the sweet life of Zach and Cody, also Disney kids. And you look at them now and wonder how many make it through with their identity actually intact. And then there are tragic ones like Judy Garland, somewhere over the rainbow, but drugged by studios, controlled her body completely. They told her to use substances and smoke cigarettes so that she can control her appetite. And she was dead at 47. I'm 34. I can only imagine what 10 years from now will look like. People forget that Hollywood has been doing this forever. This is not new. The machine just sort of changes shape. And then you have the music side of things, because acting isn't the only place where this happens. You have child singers, children who become family businesses. They literally become brands. Children who stop being children. And that's where I started asking myself something after watching the Michael biopic. What does it do to a psychological point of view from a child? Because there's a difference between discipline and building a child into a literal product. There's a difference between nurturing talent and emotionally conditioning a child to believe that their value is tied directly to their performance. A child should not be worried about feeding their family. A child should not be responsible for adults' dreams. A child should not believe, if I fail, we all fail. That is not ambition. That is a psychological pressure and sometimes trauma, because what happens when that child becomes an adult simply implodes. Some self-medicate, some disappear, some spend the rest of their lives trying to reclaim the childhood they never had, and some built Neverland. Some shave their heads, some walk away forever, and some never even get the chance to figure out who they would have become. And that's where this conversation begins. Because after watching Michael, the biopic, I could not stop comparing the Jacksons to the Quintanillas. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Michael Jackson to Selena Quintanilla. Because as a Selena fan, I sat there watching this movie And the more I watched with my husband, the more uncomfortable I got because I kept thinking, wait a minute, I know this man. Not literally, but I know this pattern. I've seen it before. I've felt this energy before, and I know this dynamic. We all do. Because Joe Jackson and Abraham Quintanilla are not identical men. They have a little bit of different backgrounds, different cultures. They might be around the same generation, but they're completely different races, different family structures. But psychologically, the parallels are a little disturbing. And let me be clear before people start getting emotional here. This is not a hate episode. This is not me attacking families. This is not me pretending I know every intimate detail behind closed doors. This is a psychological opinion piece about what happens when childhood talent becomes a family machine. That's what this is. Because I think people get really uncomfortable asking the hard questions when the outcome was success. That's the dangerous part, because if the child became iconic, if the child became rich, became a literal legend, then people start asking themselves, well, wasn't it worth it? And I need to say this very clearly. No. Success does not retroactively justify abuse. Ever. I mean, never. Because what people forget is that abuse with a goal is still abuse. Because as I was watching the biopic, I had this recurring thought. I kept asking myself, what makes Joe Jackson different from any other abusive parent? And here's the dangerous illusion. People think, well, at least he had a plan. Think about that. That's terrifying. Because random abuse feels easier to condemn. But organized abuse, structured abuse, abuse disguised as discipline, abuse disguised as a sacrifice, abuse disguised as we're doing this for the family. That's where things get murky for people, because the outcome becomes seductive even. That's where Hollywood fucks with people's heads, because Hollywood will show you pain. But if the ending is successful, then people romanticize the pain. They start thinking, well, maybe it was all worth it. I wish my parents would have done that to me. Maybe if I would have gone through that, I would have become extraordinary too. No, that's trauma logic. I've been there. Because let me ask you something very specific. How many abused children become icons? Millions of children experience trauma. Almost none become Michael Jackson. Almost none of them become Selena. So clearly, the abuse wasn't the magic ingredient. Talent was. Opportunity was. Exposure. Work ethic. But the abuse side? That was damage. And that's where the comparison gets so crazy, because Joe Jackson and Abraham Quintanilla used eerily similar emotional language. You don't want to end up poor. You don't want to struggle. You don't want the life I have. That's economic fear instilled in their children. That's survival pressure. That's a parent making a child emotionally responsible for escaping a parent's pain. And that's a huge burden, because a child should not be worried about saving the family. A child should not feel like, if I fail, then we all fail. I can't stop working. That is not ambition. That's emotional pressure. And then comes loyalty language. And Latino families know exactly what I'm talking about, don't you? Family sticks together. We build together. We sacrifice together. It sounds beautiful. Sounds like a cultural movement almost, until loyalty becomes leverage, because then leaving feels like betrayal. And that is where I started seeing Selena and Michael in the same psychological frame. Because once I saw the fathers, I couldn't stop seeing the mothers. And I know that's uncomfortable, because people don't like talking about mothers this way. But I'm going to say what I observed in both stories. The mothers are present, but they are not powerful. And before anybody gets offended, No, I'm not saying that they didn't love their children. And I'm not saying that they weren't suffering as well. I'm also not pretending I know what went on behind closed doors every single day. But as a viewer, as someone analyzing family systems, their silence is part of the story, and it's loud. Michael's mom, Selena's mom, are both there all the time. They're both visibly loving, emotionally softer than everybody else. But when the father enters the room, the energy shifts, authority shifts. And I sat there thinking, you never step in. You never really stepped in. Like, really think about that. Your child is being woken up in the middle of the night to rehearse, to go play at a gig. Your child is being verbally torn down. You know, your child is under extreme pressure and you just trust the process? That fascinates me psychologically because in households like that, especially religious households, they both had the same religions that were Jehovah's Witnesses as well. Structure gets reinforced differently. And yes, I know people are going to hear this part and get weird, but both families had strong religious structures based on obedience, family hierarchy. The man leads, the woman supports. And before anybody twists my words, I'm not attacking religion at all. I'm saying family structures absolutely shape behavior. That's just reality. And then we get into the standout child, because every family system like this usually has one. One child who becomes the thing, the emotional center, the economic center, the dream, and then that dream becomes the family's dream, the main project, the main brand. In this case, we have Michael and Selena. Let's be honest here. Both of them had raw, undeniable talent. This isn't me pretending their success was fake. Absolutely not. You cannot manufacture what they had. That kind of charisma, that kind of stage presence, that kind of instinct, that's rare. And they had it. They were born with it. But talent inside a controlling structure, that's where things get really complicated. Because now the child isn't just gifted, they're valuable. And once a child becomes economically valuable, family dynamics change. That's just the truth. And this is where I need people to really sit with something. A child performer is not just a child. They become an investment, a schedule, a paycheck, a responsibility even. And of course, I've said this several times already, a brand. And that changes how adults relate to them. Maybe not intentionally, maybe not maliciously, but it does change things. And now let's talk about Selena, because this is where I think people are going to get uncomfortable with me and maybe even upset. And I'm okay with that. Really, I'm aware. Because I love Selena. I grew up loving her. We grew up in South Texas. This is not at all an attack, but I'm not here to romanticize everything either. People love painting Selena's story in these soft, rosy colors, this innocent love story, you know, the perfect family narrative. And I'm like, really? Because I saw something else completely. Yes, did she love Chris? Absolutely. It's very noticeable. It's there. It's a given. I'm not denying that. But was marriage only about love? I don't think so. She was 23. And I know that's going to trigger some people, but hear me out. At 20 years old, in that type of household, you don't just fall in love and get married. No, that's not just romance. That's a statement. That's rebellion. That's, for example, I need out. You know, because let me tell y'all something. I've gone through hard things in my life, real horrible, heartbreaking things, but I never woke up one day and thought, F you, mom. I'm getting married and proving a point tomorrow. Why? Because I wasn't claustrophobic in my own home. I wasn't being micromanaged. I wasn't living inside a machine where every decision was filtered through family. Selena was. Her father, her siblings, the business. Everybody had input. Everybody had a say in her life and what she did, how she looked, where she performed. So when she gets married, I don't just see it as romance. I see it as autonomy. I see it as a young woman trying to make one decision that belonged to her entirely. That's powerful. And compare that to Michael. Michael's rebellion was legal. Michael walks into a lawyer's office and says, "Fire my father." That's his break. That's his independence. And in Selena's world, she took a different path. Same psychological need, same need for freedom. But in this case, Michael fired his father with a lawyer. Selena fired hers with marriage. And that's a line that might upset people. But I understand, I stand by the psychological part of this because both were trying to separate control by using different methods. Same emotional need. And what fascinates me is what each of them did with freedom. Music was Michael's oxygen. That man lived for music, was obsessed with it, built by it, driven by it. Freedom for Michael completely meant having that creative control, having creative control over his albums, his production, his sound, his movement, his style. He completely reinvented himself with his single album. And in Selena's case, I see something completely different. Look at the route she took. Music built Selena's career, but fashion was where she was trying to build her own life. That's what I see. And if you disagree, that's okay, but look at the pattern. She makes money through music, and she reinvests everything into the Selena, etc. business, her boutiques, her vision, her business, her actual passion. That tells me something very clearly because most of us understand this. Most of us have jobs, 9 to 5. I have mine. I've talked about it. And I use that money to fund what I love to do all the time, which is this. I think Selena did the exact same thing, but music was her machine and fashion was her freedom. That's how I read it. And even now, I think her narrative gets overly simplified, like her whole identity was just music. It wasn't. And I think that's exactly what makes Selena's story so haunting, because she wasn't frozen. She was becoming. And then everything stopped for her. And this is where I think the comparison between Michael and Selena gets really heartbreaking, because once I started thinking about freedom, I started thinking about childhood and what happens when childhood gets taken away from you. When you take away childhood from someone, it doesn't just disappear, poof, into nothing. It waits and it lingers inside the person. And if that sounds dramatic, look at the patterns. Michael built Neverland, filled with animals. He got his ape. He built his complete Disney fantasy, magical world. He watched cartoons. It's in the biopic. He used escapism to another level. People mocked him for that. I wouldn't say I would mock him for that because I understand what he's looking at. That wasn't just eccentric celebrity behavior. That looked like a man trying to reclaim something that he never got, which was his childhood. Normalcy. He was wondering about childhood his whole life. What might have felt to be safe in a home. And then I thought about Selena as well. And I get chills just thinking about it still right now. Because Selena wanted the same thing. She wanted a ranch. Her animals, we all know this. She wanted open land. She wanted a normal life with her husband. In the book, in Chris's book, it says she wanted to walk barefoot on the grass. That image destroys me because it tells me something. It tells me that even when you don't fully articulate it yet, something inside her was craving normalcy. Something inside her wanted softness, stillness, and freedom to be herself. And before you twist my words, I'm not saying Selena was damaged the same way Michael was. I'm saying that the longing feels familiar, and that matters. Because when children grow up inside performances, inside all this pressure and machine-like movement, inside family systems where identities get shaped around productivity, something gets delayed. And I need to say this directly because I'm not a psychologist, but I've lived enough life. I've watched enough people, read enough interviews of both of them to observe patterns. Sometimes when something huge happens to you at a young age, a part of you gets emotionally stuck there. Not forever, and not in every case, but it does happen. That younger version of you never fully gets what it needed. And sometimes adult success doesn't fix childhood deprivation. Selena was not stupid, not even close, not even a little bit. She was sharp. She was emotionally intelligent. She was super funny, loving, beautiful, warm, charismatic, and driven. And honestly, mature beyond her years. She could have been 43 in her mind. That's how mature she is. But maturity is not the same thing as exposure. That's important. You can be incredibly mature and still not have what we call colmillo, no? Because wisdom comes from experience, and experience comes from living, really living, messy living, normal type of living, meeting bad people like you and I every day, getting burned, learning boundaries, figuring people out. That's how instinct gets built. And if you grew up inside a little bubble, being admired, being loved, being told you're special, you're different, you're an outlier, a filtered world that they grow up in, you may not develop that same radar. That's not stupidity. That's just the environment you're in. And yes, I know people are going to hear that and immediately think I'm talking about Yolanda. I am, but, carefully, because I'm not reducing Selena's death to some simplistic narrative. I'm saying something more complicated here. I think Selena was trusting. I think she believed that people were just being their best versions all the time, and that's beautiful. But in the real world, we all know it doesn't work that way. It's really dangerous out here. You cannot be trusting people, especially when you haven't had enough real life exposure to predators. And that's what really hurts all of us, because I don't think she died because she was weak. I think she died at the point in her life where she was still evolving, still becoming, and still learning who she was outside of that machine. And that's devastating, because Michael actually got to unravel publicly. He got to become a full adult version of himself. And he figured it out by having all this trauma played out on TV, the reinventions, the pain, the surgeries, and even this part of his life that I'm going to leave for another episode. And that is the child abuse he was accused of. That's a completely separate part of this. And I'm not going to get into it in this video, but I will in another. Selena never got that far. And that's why her story feels different, because she died before her next chapter. And human beings are obsessed with unfinished stories. That's why we keep coming back, because we don't know who she would have become. Would she have walked away from music? Would she have become this fashion icon? Would she have started a family, or maybe done all three? Would she have fired everybody if she could? Would she have separated from her family machine completely? Would she have become a bigger star globally? We don't know. We can assume, but not knowing is torture, because right before her death, you can already see movement with the marriage, with her reclaiming her independence, with her business ownership and identity shifts. That's why it hurts us so much, and we keep coming back to her. She was becoming someone, and then she was silenced. The point of this is that sometimes parents get in the way. And I know that's really uncomfortable to a lot of people, because you're doing your best, because parents sacrifice and they love their children. They work really hard to give them the best. But sometimes adults confuse love with control. Sometimes adults confuse discipline with emotional pressure. They become so obsessed with making sure that their child makes it, and they stop asking themselves, who is this child becoming? Because every human being has their own path, their own identity, their own astrological signs out there, their own calling. And not every child is supposed to finish the dream that their parent never got to live. That's not parenting. That's projection. And I think that's where things get really dangerous, because if your child feels emotionally responsible for your happiness, your success, your literal survival, that's way too much. That's not their burden to take. A child should not be putting food on the table emotionally. A child should not be feeling like if I fail, I failed everybody. That is too much pressure for a developing human being. And yes, some of them become legends. Michael, Britney, Justin, Selena, Beyonce. I can keep going on and on, but success does not erase psychological cost. That's the illusion. That's what people really get wrong because people see the stage, the lights, and the screaming fans, and the money, and all the possibilities that open up to you with fame. It's amazing. And they think, man, you know what? It was all worth it. But they don't see the therapy, the loneliness that the person has to go through, or even how they have to keep it down and control themselves with substances, with emotional fragmentation and identity confusion, the exhaustion and pressure that they have to go through. The years spent trying to become a person instead of a product. And that's why I wanted to talk about this today. Because when I watched Michael, I sat there and I cried for some parts, and I didn't see Michael. I saw Selena as well. And once I saw it, I just couldn't unsee it. And I can't unsee it now. The truth is there. It's right in our faces. Abuse with a goal is still abuse. A child is not responsible for saving a family. And sometimes the greatest tragedy is not what happened. It's what never got the chance to happen. I'm Cleiri Quezada. This is Cleiri The Show. I hope you guys like my new set, and I'll see you next Tuesday.